Very much to all our speakers also today. I'm the chair of Ireland's Future, and Ireland's Future was set up to promote debate and discussion about a new Ireland, and just those discussions are already starting around the country, around kitchen tables. We are now bringing them around the country, and we're having, I think there's one in Armagh coming up, we had one in Galway, we had one in Cork, this one in Dublin, Derry, there's a few others happening around the country, so keep your eyes and ears open. My job today is obviously to thank all of our speakers here today, but I want to say a special thank you to Niall Murphy, who's our Secretary of Ireland's Future, and a very, very special thank you to Jerry Carlisle for really running all of these events and is doing a phenomenal job. And I'm also here today to introduce the chair of the event today, Preparing for a New Ireland, a very, very well-known journalist, probably one of the top journalists in the country today. Please put your hands together for our chair, Jerry Carlisle.
Francis, thank you so much indeed. Hello everyone, it's great to see so many people here in the round room of the Mansion House, a fabulous venue for this discussion today, and delighted to be chairing the event, and a big thank you to the organisers and our panellists for agreeing to take part. I just want to start to read you a quote from an article that I read recently in preparation for an interview that I was about to do. Everyday life was dramatically altered, from the price of rent to the way health insurance was organised. Most people struggled to find a sure footing in the new world. Many were overwhelmed by these events, but they were unlikely to speak openly about it. Now, those are the words of Sabine Renfranz, who's a German journalist. She was 15, she was living in East Germany when the wall came down. And she went on in that article to talk about how divided her country still is today, despite its territorial and political unification. The economic divisions, GDP per capita in the East, 20% less than in the West. Wages, 15% lower. Not a single major corporation has its headquarters in East Germany. But she says that for the first time since 1990, so that's 30 years, people who lived in the East are finally starting to talk about unification and the impact that it had on them, the trauma that they endured through mass unemployment, very sudden mass unemployment, a breakdown in the community-oriented society that they had built up, and their lives were in effect thrown into turmoil, she said. And they felt that their fellow country people in the West, they never knew, they never understood, and they never cared. And even today, she said that she and others believe that West Germany has no interest in getting to know the people who share their island. Now, I know that Ireland and Germany are very different countries, very different circumstances leading to the discussion of reunifying the country. But some of that reality and some of that observation, I think, can be transferred to this island as the debates around what a future Ireland might look like for its people and how that Ireland might best serve its people. So let's get started. Let me introduce our panel today. John Doyle is Professor of International Relations and Director of DCU's Institute for International Conflict Resolution. He has written more than 50 books and articles on conflict resolutions and peace processes around the world. And in more recent years, he has written extensively about the impact that Brexit has had on the Good Friday Agreement. Sheikh Dr. Umar Al-Qadri is an Islamic theologian and founder and chairperson of the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council. He is also the chief imam at the Islamic Centre in Ireland. He describes himself as a firm believer in interfaith and intra-faith relations and promotes the integration of Muslims in Ireland. Mary Lou MacDonald is the leader of Sinn Féin and TD for Dublin Central since 2011. She's also been a member of the European Parliament from 2004 until 2009. Under her leadership, the party achieved its best ever results since independence in the 2020 general election, winning 37 seats. She is the first female leader of the opposition in the Dáil. She began her political career in Fianna Fáil in 1998, but as said, she quickly realised that she was in the wrong party.
No offence.
Jim O'Callaghan is Fianna Fáil TD for Dublin Bay South, and he was elected in 2016. He is currently his party's spokesperson on justice. He's a barrister, senior counsel, and a former rugby player for Leinster, Connacht, among a range of other teams. And Neil Richmond is Fine Gael TD for Dublin Rathdown, elected at the most recent general election. He's currently Fine Gael's spokesperson on European affairs. He has been an outspoken critic of Brexit and has spoken in favour of Ireland rejoining the Commonwealth. And like Deputy O'Callaghan, he prepared a paper on what a future Ireland might look like to Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge earlier this year. So that's our panel, our 5 speakers today, and they are going to speak to you now individually for about a maximum of 5 minutes. Then I'll pick up and ask them some questions for around half an hour or so, and then the discussion will be opened up to you, the floor, for your questions to them about Ireland's future. So let's first hear from Professor John Doyle.
Thanks, Roddy, and thank you to the organisers for the invitation to speak today. I really am delighted to have been invited. I suppose in particular to talk today briefly about, in my opening remarks, why academics like myself, colleagues in Dublin City University, and across the country in a collaboration called ARANS, actually based in the very un-Republican named Royal Irish Academy here beside us, have been working to look at what are the issues that we need to know about before we're asked to vote in the Irish unity referendum rather than be told about afterwards. And I think over the last couple of years, you've seen people come together, some of whom believe in United Ireland, some of whom oppose it, some of whom have no idea what their point of view is. But what brings us together is we all agreed that a referendum like Brexit, where nobody was clear what it meant before, after, or now, would be a disaster. It would be a disaster whether that referendum was passed or not passed. Either way, it would be a disaster. And therefore, that's why the work needs to begin now. What's not commonly understood, at least among the general public, is that the Irish government does not control the timing of a unity referendum. The Good Friday Agreement leaves that exclusively in the hands of the British government, so they can control the timing, and we are bound by the Good Friday Agreement to have a concurrent decision. And under Article 3 of our Constitution, that would require a referendum. So if Boris Johnson decides to have a referendum Friday week, we are bound by treaty to have that referendum concurrently. So pretty close to Friday week, even though we weren't asked or we had no input into the timing of that decision, or didn't think it was a very sensible decision. And that government's not duty-bound to make that decision in good faith. They could make that decision for all sorts of reasons, related to Scotland, related to their re-election process, perhaps trying to kill off the debate for the future. So we need to be ready in this state. Unionist politicians do not at the moment want to take part in this debate. Lots of unionist civil society members, community activists, individuals have done so and will continue to do so, and hopefully the numbers will be greater. But we need to respect unionist politicians in their perspective, that they do not wish to hasten this vote, they will oppose it if a referendum is held, and they, like the British government, do not want to take part in discussions with us about what a new Ireland would look like. And therefore, waiting for the moment when unionist politicians will be ready to have that discussion before we prepare is not only pointless, but I think it's actually disrespectful to their position. We, in this state, those who believe the discussion needs to take place in Northern Ireland internationally, need to lead that discussion. It's realistic, I think, that unionist politicians will join that debate really only after a referendum is passed, rather than before. But we can't ask voters to go to the polls not knowing what we discuss in those talks with all sorts of politicians in the aftermath of that. So we need to put our proposals on the table now. And that needs to have the maximum amount of detail consistent with the fact that there will be some discussions afterwards. On the substance of issues, not just the big questions about would it be a federal Ireland or a single parliament? If it was a federal Ireland, would it just be an assembly or a parliament in Belfast, or would it also be one in Cork and Galway? Maybe Meath, according to some of my colleagues who live in that county. So what are the pros and cons of that? What does the international evidence tell us about those debates? But we know already from the public debate that the implementation of Sláinte Care will probably have as much impact for middle ground voters. They don't have strong views either way on the constitutional question, but they would want to know that a health system is going to be free at the point of use, I suspect. And I think if for those people who wish to win a referendum, not just to hold it at the point where evidence is clearly available, then that's probably as significant an issue as the bigger minority rights, civil rights, Bill of Rights questions that are there. So the question of what issues of substance we need to discuss, get evidence on from other countries, get evidence from how much it would cost, how we would organise it. So perhaps at the point of having a referendum, the health system in the south we perceive to be stronger than that in the north. Though I think the caricature of brilliant in the north, terrible in the south is not true in either case, and certainly for people who have to live with the queues for not only a hospital but for a GP in the north are well aware of that. But it's not commonly known. People have, I think, a very cardboard cutout view of the two health systems. People will also need to know what the process will be about. So what will happen before a referendum? What amount of detail will be on the table? What will people know for certain? And then what we can't know for certain, because those discussions with unions, political parties in particular, and the British government will not have taken place. So we need to be respectful of that and say, well, here's the view of the Irish Parliament, but there's some discussion still to go on. Here's what we're willing to pay for, here's how we think we should organise it, but there'll be some discussion, perhaps the Citizens' Assembly. And then probably after unity takes place, there will be a requirement for another referendum to make some changes to the Constitution that wouldn't happen at the moment of unity, but would happen as part of those later discussions that would go on.
1 minute, John.
And so, finally, was going to be my next word, so that was good. I believe that this discussion, which has been going on in civil society, like what Ireland Future is doing, and also in academia in terms of the research side of things, now needs to move to the political domain. I think the time is right for that. I also believe it needs to be an Oireachtas committee that would organise it, rather than purely government. Government clearly will have a part. But the likelihood of Irish unity happening from beginning to end in the lifetime of any single government is not high, even if a referendum was to happen at the earliest possible moment where it would be sensible to do so. So we need to have some consensus where possible among the political parties as to what would be on the table if a referendum was passed, north and south, and where we don't have a consensus, what the options would be that people would see that they could look to afterwards. And I think only a Oireachtas committee that has membership of senior politicians who can speak for the political parties, who have the authority on that committee and in the media and the general public to be perceived to be speaking for the future of the political parties. That for me is the nature. And for me, I think that's the next big step we need to make in moving this forward, is to convene that Oireachtas committee and let it prepare the way for discussing the evidence, bringing in representatives of civil society, those people who do want to take, and see if a consensus can be found. In the way, as I mentioned earlier, there was a consensus on the direction of Sláinte Care. Maybe not consensus on the speed or the payment of it, but there is a broad consensual perspective of where we go next on healthcare. And I think it is broadly possible to achieve that in the Oireachtas at the moment on a cross-party basis. And I think that would immeasurably move forward what we know and what we need to know before we have a referendum. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Akarja, Tiaif Agus, Assalamu alaikum. Kore Mila Mahagav, Asanguri, Kunlau, Live Enough. Is Misha Dr. Umar Al Qadri, Agus Misha Kaher like an IMPIC. IMPIC, the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council, is an all Ireland representative body of Irish Muslims with affiliated Islamic centres and mosques in various different cities like Dublin, Galway, Portlaoise, Waterford, Belfast, and members in all 32 counties. Our work is divided into 3 core competencies: advocacy, policy, and bridge building. And it is a matter of great pride for me that from all of these 3 competencies, it is bridge building that we spend the most time on. And it is in this spirit of bridge building, we are here today to speak about Ireland's future. I want to commend and thank Ireland's Future team for inviting me here today and for inviting diverse guests to their events throughout Ireland. Because Ireland's future is not just about one community or one group in our country. The idea of a new Ireland and a united Ireland is the opportunity to create something new. It's an opportunity to create something different, an opportunity to reconsider our social contract and shape the country in the way we want, rather than the one we have inherited from the trials and tribulations of history. Irish people of colour, like myself, have a lot to bring to that conversation. And I'm personally invested in this conversation, not because I had a Republican granny that fought in the GPO, but because I have been in this country for almost 2 decades. I'm on record saying that in the 26 counties, the Irish Muslim experience is one of the best, if not the best, in the whole of Europe. In the 6 counties, however, the narrative is completely different. As nationalism becomes stronger, regressive elements within political unionism seek out new vulnerable targets. Women, LGBTQI communities, disabled people, travelers, Muslims, and other minority communities. In January this year, the BMCA, the Belfast Multicultural Association, was burnt down in a horrific arson attack, which the PSNI described as a deliberate hate crime. BMCA was not just a mosque or an Islamic center. In fact, the BMCA run a soup kitchen. They run a food bank. They provided shelter to the homeless. They provided essential support to the frontline workers in health service. They provided food parcels, running errands throughout the pandemic. But as of today, the PSNI has made no arrest in connection with this horrific attack, on not just a place of worship, but a focal point for the entire community. So, ladies and gentlemen, such an attack would have been unthinkable in the 26 counties. And that, for me, is the crux of the issue. Where there is such a difference between the lived experience of Muslim communities and other minorities in the 6 and the 26 counties, political unionism should not be surprised when those communities reach to the conclusion that despite having no historical or familial connection to the constitutional question, Black people, people of color, Muslims, LGBT, and other non-traditional communities living in the North decide that partition is not working for them either. And to be blunt, political unionism is shooting itself in the foot here. Because in the 6 counties, recent polls have showed that nationalist and unionist split in voting is approximately 45% each. The constitutional question is not about traditional identity, but in all likelihood will be decided by the 10% who remain undecided. And a large proportion of those are people that are new arrivals, migrants, or people of color. And so, looking at all of this, having made this country my home, having started and raised a family here, I mean, my oldest son, Ahmed, is 14 and already taller than me, having seen the difference in the experiences of my community in the 26 counties and my community in the 6 counties, I say proudly, I believe in a united Ireland. I pray for a united Ireland, and by God, I am willing to work to deliver a united Ireland. Gori Mila Mahaga.
So, Gurmayagov agus time intach sos even so sonoich starul so done crinu in you. As they say, follow that. Can I thank the organisers for hosting this event and for allowing me to be part of it? I greatly appreciate it, and what better place for us to meet than here in the round room of the Mansion House. And whilst I never advocate that we be captive to our past, because our job is to write our present, to imagine our future and to deliver it, I think we should be conscious that we meet in a place where a century ago, brave women, more brave men, sadly, than women, met and imagined a new tomorrow. Ask themselves the question that we now are faced with in our generation: what country do we want? What country can we have? And what country can we share? And so this conversation is a really, really important one. I would regard it as existential for us as Irish men and Irish women, Irish, British, neither, both, Muslim, Christian, of no particular faith, black or white, settled or travellers, green or orange. This is the moment now to have the conversation and to prepare for the change that is underway. Where we start, I believe, is to foster an acknowledgement and an acceptance that change is the order of the day. I think so long as leaders bury their heads in the sand and deny the very obvious generational turning of the wheel, the very obvious demographic changes, but more importantly, the change in expectation for our citizens, north and south, for women, for our LGBT community, for all of us. And I believe that we should frame this conversation in the language of opportunity, not fear. Not winners and losers, not any zero-sum game, but opportunity for all of us, in which each has a voice and none has a veto. So all of those perspectives will enrich our conversation. And whilst John and the academics and practitioners are right to say, in all likelihood, unionism won't formally engage with this conversation until we have had our referendum, I still believe that it is critical that we invite that perspective and make it clear that nobody is handing down a new Ireland on tablets of stone to the populace. As the leader of Sinn Féin and the Republican movement, I'm not doing that. That, frankly, is not my job. I will lead, and we will lead, those of us who are Republicans, in delivering our perspective, our ideas, and commanding and marshalling all of our energy to make this process succeed. But we are very, very well aware that it will take all of us to make this right. They say that it takes the village to raise the child. It takes the nation in all of our parts, in all of our diversity. Whether we had grannies in the GPO, whether we had relatives in the H blocks, whether that's not part of our experience and our people served and fought in the First or Second World War, all of that is in the mix, but it's not really the point. The point is that Ireland must advance, and the question for us is, what does that look like? And what contribution do we make? So I look forward to the questions and remarks, and I'm delighted that we are here. I agree with John. If you ask me where practically should this conversation start about reunification, I would say let's talk about our health service. We have the Bengoa process in the north. We have Sláinte Care in the south. Two platforms for radical change. The smart money would join those up. The smart money would work together for a single-tier universal health service for all of our people across the island. So, go raibh maith agaibh agus rith táim iontach sásta bheansa.
I want to start by thanking Ireland's Future for organising this event and for inviting me to speak at it. I'm not at all surprised there's such a large crowd here today, because the level of interest and discussion and excitement about the topic of Irish reunification has grown considerably in the past number of years. This is no longer a topic that's of interest to a small, limited group on the island of Ireland. Instead, what we've seen in recent years is more people are coming out to discuss and debate this issue. And more importantly, we're hearing from people from abroad who come to this and look at this topic through a lens and with a perspective that many of us haven't looked at it with before. Listen, can I just make three preliminary points which I think are important? The first point I want to make is that the pursuit of Irish reunification through peaceful means is a perfectly legitimate political objective. And I think for too long it's been presented as though there was something subversive or sinister about it. That is not the case. And people are perfectly entitled to state and assert that they believe and they want to see Irish reunification. In fact, if you look at the Irish Constitution, it's also a constitutional aspiration. Article 3 refers to the will of the Irish nation to be to unite all the people in diversity together. And Article 3 also recognises that there shall be a united Ireland if it's the wish of the majority of the people in both jurisdictions exercising their franchise. So we need to recognise it's not just a political objective, it's a constitutional aspiration, and it's the logical consequence of the talks and the agreement that took place back in 1998, which recognised that people were going to be able to pursue by peaceful means reunification. The second preliminary point I want to make is that just as it is a perfectly legitimate objective to seek Irish reunification, I think we need to acknowledge that it's also perfectly legitimate to oppose Irish reunification. And just as it is my cherished aim to see a united Ireland, I know that there are many unionist people in Northern Ireland, and it's their cherished aim to see the retention of the Union. And similarly, there are many people around the country who are hesitant about this debate, and they're concerned about it, and we need to engage with those people as well. And finally, there's apathy. A lot of people just aren't interested in politics. There are some people involved in politics think that, well, this isn't the pressing political issue of our time. But we do need to engage with the opposition. We need to acknowledge the opposition, and we need to engage with it, because if we don't engage with it, we're really revealing that we're not comfortable with the strength of the argument that we're making. The third point, preliminary point I want to make, is that Irish reunification is about the future. It's not about the past. And that's why I welcome the name of the organisation, Ireland's Future. Like, I know in the centenary of partition, people look at Irish reunification in the context of what happened 100 years ago. But the world and Ireland has changed immeasurably since then. 100 years ago, the political landscape of this country was dominated by the twin monoliths of green and orange, of Catholicism and Protestantism. Those monoliths are no longer monoliths. And what we've seen, and as the doctor has mentioned here, we see all types of diverse politics developing. And that provides an opportunity. Because let's be frank about it, although partition was imposed by the decision of the imperial government, what really happened was that there was a division between the Irish people because of the irreconcilability of those twin monoliths. And as they fade away, the obvious pathway is towards reunification. Listen, the real question we all need to answer is, what is the benefit of Irish reunification? Because I know people may think emotionally it's terrible what happened to Ireland in the past. It may be, but that's not a reason to vote for Irish reunification in the future. And other people may think, well, we need to deal with the issues of housing in the south, or maybe third-level education in the north. They're two crucial issues, but also it's not a reason to vote for Irish reunification. The reason to vote for Irish reunification is because it would transform the island, and it would create a new country in which there would be greater opportunities for people living in both jurisdictions. It would create a stronger country that would have much more influence throughout the world. It would create a country with a much bigger economy that would increase the standard of living for everybody on the island. It would create a country with a much more diverse population. One of the criticisms of the two jurisdictions is that we had very limited diversity in both jurisdictions. But it also would be a shining beacon to the world of what can be achieved through reconciliation and agreement, because it would send out a message to the world that this country, that historically had too much violence and historically had too much division, came together with other parts of the country. They merged together to form a better union for themselves in the recognition that was in the interests of both groups on the island. Listen, finally, there's another reason for reunification as well. It's not as prosaic as the last one, but it is Brexit. And we need to recognise that the reason why this debate has gone up a number of gears in the past 5 years is because of Brexit. I used to think Brexit was a political event that took place in 2016. It's not. Brexit is a political ideology that demands constantly that there is tension between the British government and the European Union. And at some stage, it's the protocol in respect of Northern Ireland. At another stage, it's going to be fisheries policies. But this is going to continue endlessly. And we need to recognise that the opportunity for everyone on this island lies in us ourselves developing and agreeing our own future. Gormalgov.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much to Ireland's Future for organising this pertinent and really welcome event. And there's a great beauty in coming last, particularly when the previous speaker has ended his wonderful speech referring to Brexit, and that's what you've made your living out of for the last 5 to 6 years. So I'm glad I didn't write a speech, Jim, because I'd be throwing it away at this stage. But I do want to very much address and follow on, and it's very good to follow on from the points that have been made by all our panellists. And I want to start off with, to be honest, addressing some criticisms that have been labelled at Ireland's Future, at all of us on the panel, and various people across the society who dare to speak of the desire to have Ireland reunited. And those criticisms come from people in, yes, the traditional unionist community, from certain commentators, from certain academics, from members of my own political party. And I say them quite clearly, now is the time. As Jim alluded to, Brexit has changed everything. I fundamentally and wholeheartedly believe in a united Ireland. I always have done. But I am now convinced that not only will we see a united Ireland in my lifetime, but we're going to be voting on this in a border poll a lot sooner than anyone ever expected. Not down to the work of ourselves or the aspirations, but by a thoughtless decision by the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. The chaos that has ensued post the Brexit referendum has led us directly to this point where we're prepared to sit in these rooms and put across a vision and aspiration for United Ireland that perhaps was different to anything that came before. And I don't know what's worse, me aspiring for us to join the Commonwealth or Mary Lou having been in Fianna Fáil, but we're going to have to park all those issues. And we're going to have to realise that being in favour of a united Ireland is not an incendiary opinion. It's not a political tool, and it should never be seen as offensive to our friends in unionism and our family members in unionism. And I say that because the vast majority of my family living in Northern Ireland are unionists. I didn't have a great-granny at the Easter Rising. I did have a couple of family members, but I'm fairly sure they were shooting into the GPO rather than shooting out. But that doesn't take away from my fundamental belief that an independent Irish state with a full membership of the European Union is something that we can and simply need to achieve. It's no longer good enough for something for us that we want it. We simply have to achieve it, not just to fulfill historical aspirations, but for our future generations, to show a united, independent Ireland can and simply will be a better place than the two jurisdictions that we know on this island. And when we look to build a united Ireland, we're looking to build a new Ireland, a confident, mature state that can throw behind the divisions that separated so many of us in the past. A number of people who criticise this conversation say, well, reconciliation isn't complete. Let's be frank, for some people, reconciliation will never be complete. But that's why we are talking about Ireland's future, where we acknowledge the difficulties of the past and indeed the present, but we look forward to a future saying, yes, we acknowledge those difficulties, but we can achieve something so much better. We look at Brexit Britain, we look at Le Pen's France, we look at Salvini's Italy, Trump's America, and we look at the potential for a new united Ireland. It's a warm place, it's a generation, it's a generous place. It's not going to be a state that will all be about Brits out. I fundamentally believe it's going to be a state that is about Brits in. The 300,000 British citizens who live in this jurisdiction and the near 1 million British citizens who live in the north. I don't want anyone of a unionist persuasion of other to feel that they have to leave a united Ireland. I want them to stay, not just because it would make the dinner table at my family Christmas a lot smaller if they all left, but I want them to stay because this is their country as much as it is our country, any of us on the panel or any of in the room. And we will respect their identity. But before we talk about that, as every single panelist has spoken about, when we are addressing this issue, we need to address two things in terms of our preparation. How do we actually achieve this? What is the process? As John has said, this is down to the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland. The ability to call a border poll is not in the gift of any of us, but the ability to state what the process will be is not. And that is a challenge for all of us who hold political office and everyone else to say this is what the process will be, this will be how it will be inclusive, and this is how we can achieve a better Ireland. I look forward, more importantly, you've heard our opinion, I look forward to hearing your opinions, addressing them where I can, and continuing this conversation constantly. It's not just about one event in Cork or in Galway or in Dublin or Armagh. This is the conversation that has to happen every hour of every day in a non-confrontational manner, and I'm really looking forward to the next hour. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all very much. So we're going to talk here on the stage for about the next 30 minutes or so, a little more, and then we'll take your questions. So, John, I'll start with you just to get your views on this, because the overall picture, all the words and everything that's been said so far, the process is obviously important, but what comes after the process is critical. What a new Ireland will look like, how it will actually work. And those are the practical things that I think most people, if they look at Brexit and they had the referendum, they didn't know what Brexit would deliver. So that is where I think Ireland's future are coming from here, not to repeat that mistake of not having a plan. So if we look at the Good Friday Agreement, It has done much of the groundwork in terms of the building blocks, the east-west links, the north-south bodies, the cross-border cooperation on health, education, food, energy. There's a long list. But yet we've seen the outworkings of that agreement and how it doesn't work a lot of the time. So is there still an awful lot to do in practical terms to create this new Ireland?
Yes, is the short answer. And that's why it needs to begin now, even though I don't think any of us would want to call a referendum in the next 6 months, because we wouldn't have had time to prepare for it. There'll be differences to when precisely we'd want it to happen, but nobody wants it to be tomorrow, because we're not ready. We haven't put that proposition. There's probably, if you got the civil service to list all the things that would have to happen in the Constitution in Ireland, it would go on for at least 1,000 pages. The Scottish Government public document, which was a distillation, was 890 pages long. And they were criticised for not having enough detail on currency and on NATO and everything. So 1,000 pages. And actually there was a huge appetite for it. They had to reprint and reprint and reprint, even though they assumed people would just look at a summary. But fundamentally, a much smaller number of issues are going to be the ones that are decisive for people making up their mind.
What do you think they will be?
I think it will be how an Ireland is framed, what it looks like politically. How do we guarantee that those people who will have voted no very recently before we created Ireland will feel very comfortable. And I'm heartened that some of the unionist leaders, particularly those associated with the UP, have been very firm that they will stay on the island of Ireland. They will campaign to the best of their ability against, but if it happens under the rules of the Good Friday Agreement, it will happen. But we want to assure them that even if they are on the losing side, to use that terrible phrase, but nonetheless they vote the way there was a minority view, that our legislation, our constitutional provisions to guarantee their rights, the whole concept of a Bill of Rights for the future of Ireland, what that would list. Because you're still seeing people, maybe a little bit disingenuous, but Jeffrey Donaldson still talking about his right to a British citizenship. Mm-hmm. Absolutely guaranteed in the Good Friday Agreement. Both the Irish and UK governments have asserted that this is, not on the table for discussion. It's absolutely affirmed. But I think that's not heartfelt. People don't feel it. So even reiterating the things we've done is useful. But then I think how we would manage that and how we would set it out. And then there are the practical things, which I think especially for probably the middle 20%, I would put it a bit bigger than 10, I think. I think there are people who, even if the health system wasn't great, they'll vote for United Ireland. And even if we had the best health system on planet Earth, they would vote against it. But there are certainly people who worry about the health service, who worry about the cost of it, who worry about housing in Dublin and elsewhere in the island of Ireland. But so do the people of the Republic of Ireland worry about those things separately from the debate in the constitutional future. So I think what I believe in Rock's Kennedy could pull around it could have, I suppose, the luxury and the research time to look at everything, but also distill down to probably the 10 things or so that will be absolutely decisive. And for me, those are minority rights, protections for people who would feel uncomfortable leaving United Ireland, and that is a diverse. I think it would be absolutely wrong to frame that as minority rights for unionists. Mm-hmm. It needs to be absolutely crystal clear that unionists would have their absolute rights protected, but so will people of colour, so will women as a majority on the island, so will LGBT, so will travellers in a much better way than is there today. So I think that concept of rights has to include unionism, but be broader.
Okay.
And then the practical things, the economy and health.
And I do want to talk in as much detail as we can about health and economy. But Jim, with your legal hat on, who guarantees the right of people in Northern Ireland to be British if Britain no longer exists, depending on what happens in Scotland?
Well, the people of the new Ireland who put in place a new constitution. And that's one of the requirements that we need to know what will happen if there is going to be a united Ireland. There's a series of strands, but the first strand I would have thought is that there has to be a draft constitution prepared which will set out what are the rights of individuals. And it's not beyond our collective wisdom to have a constitution prepared which recognises the historic conflicting loyalties of different groups on the island. But in terms of the rights, the United Kingdom hasn't left the European Convention on Human Rights. Like, I don't think establishing a Bill of Rights for a new Ireland is going to be that difficult, because we are all on the island party to the European Convention on Human Rights. I would like to see more added to it, and to ensure that there were protections for different traditions, expressly recognising the different traditions in Northern Ireland. But I don't think that's beyond our collective wit. I agree with John that there needs to be work done, but like the constitutional strand is one strand. We also need a body of work done in terms of what would the economy of a new Ireland look like, what would the health service in United Ireland look like, what would the legal system look like, you know, how would we approach climate change in a United Ireland. And also I think we need to have a recognition that just because we vote in favour of a United Ireland, it doesn't mean that the irreconcilable differences that exist and the grievances that exist in Northern Ireland are going to fade away immediately. So we need a process of reconciliation to deal with that issue as well.
Mary Lou, I think most people would agree that if you're going to try and convince people to vote for a new United Ireland, then people will have to be convinced that it will be better than what is currently in place, north and south. So on the issue of health, which is such a hot button issue, north and south, because the systems are both in a pretty big mess, what's Sinn Féin's plan? I mean, could you see extending the NHS to the full island?
Well, our plan, and I think what we need, is a national health service. That's what the island needs, and it's interesting. Before the institutions were re-established after that long hiatus, there had been an industrial dispute involving healthcare workers, and I was out on the picket with them, and I asked them, so what's happening? Describe the dilemma within the hospital that you work. And they listed all of the same issues that the health service is facing here: over-reliance on agency workers, issues around diagnostics and capacity and all of those things. So I made the case, and I consistently make the case, and I've made this to successive Taoiseach, that the preparation needs to happen now. I mean, I absolutely agree in respect of an Oireachtas committee. I think we need a citizens' assembly though as well, because we have to democratise this process. The policymakers, the legislators, the leaders, civic and political, will have their view and will have to lift a good deal of this load. But for this to really work, we must engage the widest range of grassroots opinion as we can. And for example, on the issue of a Bill of Rights, I mean, Britain is still within the European Convention on Human Rights, but they've been signalling since Theresa May was their foreign secretary, that they're looking to come out of that. So I'm concerned about that. And I look at this from a rights perspective, not so much minority rights, although minorities must be protected, there is no doubt. But we need to talk about everybody's rights. Like, if you build a society that is based on the foundations of rights that are not just proclaimed, but rights that can be realised, including in the courts, then I think you're building that space for everyone. And on the issue of British identity and so on, I mean, we're not starting from ground zero. I mean, a huge amount of very good work has been done within the fabric of the Good Friday Agreement. And the only thing that will stop, to answer some of the previous discussion around, you know, how could British people or those loyal to the Crown feel secure that that identity will be protected, preserved, and will mean something? That's a conversation that we would have to have with the British government of the day. And the final point that I'd like to make just on this opportunity is, it is true to say that the Secretary of State on paper is the person who will trigger the referendum, but the realpolitik is that decision will be made in number 10 Downing Street. There's no pro-consul for the North is going to make that call. So therefore, in addition to preparation, or to drive preparation, we need a government in Dublin that is serious about this issue. We need a government that says, not in a confrontational way, but in a very practical, you know, common sense way, change is happening, and they are duty bound to prepare for that. And the British government, for their part, and I've raised this with Theresa May, Boris Johnson, I've had no joy thus far, but I'll keep raising it with them. They do have to make clear what they regard as the threshold or the trigger or the moment, how they would measure that the time is right now for a referendum. So we need information on the table, we need political will, and then we need proper preparation. And the health system, I think we could do worse than choose that terrain. And I'll tell you why. Because it matters now.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
I want to explore it in more
now.
detail, but just Neil, on that point about the Irish government and the process involved, we know it's the Secretary of State, as Mary Lou says, ultimately number 10. But could you imagine them making a unilateral decision without full consultation with Dublin?
This government, absolutely.
Really?
And that's my opinion on this British government. And that's why I think this conversation and the level of preparation has now become so much more important than any time over the last 20 odd years, because we're dealing with an utterly reckless and untrustworthy British government who could at any stage just call a border poll, call a Scottish independence referendum without due consideration, like we're all trying to address here, for the people that it actually impacts. And that's why I think it's really important that we do continue to try and hold them to account. But we've seen countless times that this particular British government, the ministers in cabinet, aren't as engaging as previous ones. And that's why it falls to people not just in this jurisdiction but crucially in Northern Ireland to continue to have the preparation, identify the issues. We cannot rely on this British government for anything.
Umar, let me talk to you about identity, because this is a huge element and a lot is talked about British identity. But of course, as you say, you've been here 20 years. Will you talk to us from your perspective how important your identity is and how you relate that then to your loyalty, I suppose, to this country, to this state?
Sure. I think people have to understand that identities are not monolith. People can have different identities within identities. I mean, I identify myself as Irish, but also sometimes as a Pakistani or as a Dutch, because I grew up in the Netherlands and I was born in Pakistan. I have parents in Pakistan. And we shouldn't paint everybody with the same brush. I talked in my opening speech about regressive element within unionists. But I do want to mention that we actually, within unionists, there are sensible people that we can talk to. We had Eden Croke Park, I'm sure you all remember that, where we were able to celebrate our identity of being a Muslim and also being Irish at the same time. We celebrated two types of identities that we as Irish Muslims possess. And in that event, Mary Lou was very kind to accept the invitation to speak also, but we also had Senator Ian Marshall, who is a unionist, who came and also attended the event. And I think it's important to understand that people have different identities, and we must acknowledge their identities. We must accept their identities, and then try to focus on the fact that, you know, despite having different identities, we have one citizenship. We're all citizens of this island of Ireland. And it's okay to be a unionist. It's okay to be a Republican, nationalist, a Muslim, or whatever. But the main thing is, as citizens, we're all equal in this, and we can celebrate each other's identities. I mean, one of the questions I was actually thinking about, and would you believe, someone who has only been here 2 decades, I was thinking about, what if we have a united Ireland? What about our flag? I mean, the tricolour for me means a lot, because it shows different identities, and it shows that bridge building. And I was thinking, what happens when we have a united Ireland when it comes to the flag? And then, you know, the more I thought, and I realized that that's the question that everyone in that discussion, everyone with different identities will have to together answer, and all of their identities have to reflect in the new Ireland, in the symbols, etc. So my answer to that would be that we have different identities. In a new Ireland, everyone's identity should be accepted, should be acknowledged, but at the same time, the emphasis should be on common citizenship.
Back to health, because I do want to, it's a massive topic, and it's a very practical way, I suppose, of exploring what a new Ireland would look like. Neil, what would your plan be for the health service in a united Ireland?
Yeah, and it's not just health, but health is where you start. It's where you take the best of both jurisdictions. We cannot say that, and you look at history, when my parents were my age and having this discussion, a lot of people moved to Northern Ireland because it was simply a better place. You know, both in terms of the economy, both in terms of social rights. You know, it was before the Troubles, and being a Southern Protestant, you didn't necessarily have the rights that you may have aspired to. But when you look at the health system, you look at where the North has got certain things right, it's important not to do down our own health service either. It is quite good, it scores well, and there is aspects in both health services that we can take from. And where we've seen cross-border cooperation, be it in Galvin, be it in certain types of cancer therapies, ironically under Edwin Poots as health minister, a lot of this was pushed forward. It's championing those aspects. There isn't one blueprint when we say we're going to have the Dutch model or we're going to have the NHS and we're simply going to put it down. Because
would you have it free at the point of entry, free at the point of need?
Absolutely.
100%. No role for private health insurance?
I believe there may be a role for private health insurance, but free at the point of entry is a very different thing. But in that, I was speaking to a friend of mine who, to all intents and purposes, is a loyalist from Lisburn. He voted against the Good Friday Agreement, and that is his number one and only concern at this stage.
The health service?
The health service.
Okay.
Free at
Jim,
the point of entry.
Yes. Jim, what's your plan?
Well, I think we need to recognise that Sláintecare is not a million miles away from the NHS system. Sláintecare is aiming to get towards a situation where it's free at the point of entry. And, you know, I think there probably would be a role for private healthcare in the New Ireland, to be honest with you. But, like, at present, there is ongoing cooperation. But I suppose what the pandemic has shown is that there really should be much more cooperation to deal with issues such as the pandemic and the health response to it on the island of Ireland. And if anything, recent events have illustrated the illogicality of partition and the importance of having a more unified health system. But I think it is an issue that we need to get together health economists, people of expertise, to prepare a paper as to what a health service for a new United Ireland would look like. Politicians aren't going to be able to identify that now. That's why the work has to be done by different groups, whether it's in health, whether it's in the economy, whether it's in other areas. A huge amount of work needs to be done. I can just say as well, Audrey, when you were starting, you referred to German reunification. What we're planning here, I think, is unprecedented. German reunification was, in a way, completely different. East Germany collapsed and had to be taken in by West Germany. And obviously, Germans wanted to see that happen. But what we're talking about when it comes to Irish unification, it's two entities which have a lot going for them in terms of the services that exist in both entities. We don't want to get into a game of economic one-upmanship to see, oh, we're better here, you're better there. So really, it is not about a takeover, it is about a merger. And I've spoken to many unions, and I'm actually surprised. I gave a paper in Cambridge last March. I was surprised at the level of interest from people from a unionist perspective afterwards, who contacted me and asked me to have Zoom meetings with them. 3 loyalists came down from Dublin during the lockdown. I had to meet them in Merrion Square. They want to talk about it. I was on a television programme with Doug Beattie, and I was saying the usual thing about, oh, we need to prepare a constitution. And the interviewer said to Doug Beattie, what do you think about Jim O'Callaghan's proposal about a new constitution for a new Ireland? And he put me in my place, Doug Beattie. He said to me, show it to me. And again, we keep talking about this. Oh, and we'll do this, we'll do that. Let's show it to people from a unionist perspective, because it's hard for them to engage at this stage unless some preparatory work is done. Hand it over to them. That's what we're planning. Let them kick through it.
What about you on health, Mary Lou?
So,
free at the point of entry?
Well, absolutely. And whatever about there being a reality of private medicine in the New Ireland, what we need to really knuckle down on is what will the state sponsor. That's the issue here. And I know in my own work, talking to people of all persuasions, by the way, nationalists, Republicans, unionists, loyalists, the thing that is most commonly raised with me is health, beyond flags and emblems, although those are important issues too. Where I would start, given that we have Ben Goa in the north, which is a platform for transformation, actually introduced by Michelle O'Neill, and we have Sláintecare, and we'd need a whole other discussion to assess their success or their speed of implementation. But where I would start actually is with workforce planning. We've had a very good development in Derry, in Magee University, with the graduate medical school. We have some numbers starting. We need to ramp that up. You see, for the one thing I know, however technically we will assemble our new health system, we are not doing it without doctors, without nurses, without care workers, without therapists in all of their variety. And the truth is, north and south, we are running up short. So the conversation around healthcare has to include third level institutions of education, and we need to figure out how do we produce enough GPs to ensure that we don't endure the kind of GP shortage that we're living with now? And likewise, how do we hold on to our nurses and our midwives, who are just outstanding professionals and who are now saying, well, you know, when this is over in depressingly high numbers, do you know what? I think we'll see what it looks like in Australia or Canada or whatever. And I'm all for travel, broadening the mind. But I want to say to all of those, we need you here at home because we need to build this system. So in my view, that's where I would start today. But I also accept that there needs to be a wider conversation. It does need to involve experts and health economists and so on. But I tell you what, the first thing it needs is political seriousness. Like, this is not going to have, we could talk about this forever and lament the woes of our systems north and south and commend the idea of an Irish National Health Service free at the point of delivery. But if we're not prepared, if we don't have political leadership to say, right, knuckle down, let's talk about it. What do the nuts and bolts? How do we build on Altnagelvin and the areas of commonality, you know, the services in Tala Hospital or in Crumlin? What does that look like? And crucially, how do we ensure that we give, particularly our younger people who want to be doctors or nurses, who see their future in that role, give them the chance, don't have them with sky-high points and still forced to go to Poland, and no disrespect to Poland or their system, to study medicine or biomedics. So make room, let's make room for the next generation. And then let's us do our job. And I believe the generation coming up after, I have immense confidence in them. I think they're up and at it. And one of the challenges for those of us in political leadership now is to make room for them to actually deliver the thing that we dream of. And I think if we take that approach, I think we won't be too far wrong.
We have another 10 minutes or so here, and then we'll open it to yourselves for some questions. On the economy, John, you know, we always hear, oh, the Republic can't afford the North. Now, will you talk to us about that aspect of viewpoint, and just the importance that managing the economy, developing the economy on an all-island basis will have in any future planning?
Yeah, I mean, the last piece I actually wrote with the slightly provocative title was Why the Northern Ireland Subvention Does Not Matter.
Does not matter.
Does not matter.
Okay.
Because in some ways it dazzles everybody, because it's 10 billion, it's 30,
yeah.
you know. But most of that figure is irrelevant to United Ireland. You know, so any national accounting system divides up the costs around the different regions of a country. So does Ireland, but we don't go figure out exactly how much Leitrim has contributed towards the health system versus how much they paid in taxes. You just don't do it. But you do it when a country is more separated out, like the United Kingdom is, in terms of its public accounting system. So Northern Ireland is charged 1.2 billion sterling for defence. Almost none of that is spent in Northern Ireland. You know, its contribution to Trident, to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The defence budget of the Irish state, by comparison, crossed the €1 billion threshold for the first time ever this year. While the United Ireland could decide whatever it wants to do in defence, I think we do need to increase at least the wages of the soldiers and some of the equipment we give to them when they go abroad on peacekeeping missions for sure. So there's some extra cost. I suspect the new government wouldn't decide to put up the defence budget by 150% as its first act. And there's lots of other pieces like that. There's definitely some real costs in there because of the weakness. But for me, the real issue is, why is the Northern Ireland economy so weak? It was the richest part of the country sort of 100 years ago. It was the industrial heartland of the island. You know, why is it that foreign direct investment is almost non-existent? Tourism is 1/7. So tourism always talks about how do you get people close to your market and then get them to your market. So if you get them, you know, to London, can you persuade them to Wales? Can you persuade them to the north of England? We're almost at saturation levels in Dublin, Galway, the Cliffs of Moher, Newgrange, but almost none of those visitors cross the border into Northern Ireland. So, you know, if that was a normal part of the experience on a pretty small geographic space, that's if FDI levels in Northern Ireland were similar, not even better or our best bit, but similar. If the economy in Northern Ireland was equivalent to the average in the Republic of Ireland, there wouldn't be a subvention. We'd have a surplus. We'd wonder how to spend it on health and improving those other issues. It's the gap. It's the gap in higher education. It's the gap in finishing second school. It's the gap in investment and tourism. Dublin is got too much of the economy in it. There are international measures for what percentage of your economy is in your commercial capital, usually the capital city, but in some countries it's other places like Australia where you have a different model. And if that gets above a certain level, it's almost an iron rule of economics that you have trouble. You have trouble with housing, congestion. Companies look in and they go, well, actually I can't find 1,000 people to do this thing I want to do in LinkedIn or whatever else. But they're not going to Belfast at the moment. And why, when it's 2 hours up the road, rents are cheaper, wages are cheaper, why is it? And I think it's about political instability, it's about the future, it's about Brexit now, which has further complicated the notion. So I think in the concept of United Ireland, it's not just get fixated on the subvention, which is its historic legacy of economic weakness, but rather what would it take to have wage levels similar to levels in the South? What would it take to have a balanced budget over a 5-year cycle, not 50 years of deficits in a row, which ultimately somebody has to pay for eventually. So for me, that's the issue. It's not a subvention, it's the weakness of the northern economy in skills, in attracting investment in tourism. All of things are fixable. And from my point of view, in the context of United Ireland, I can't think of a single intellectual reason as to why in the context of United Ireland, Belfast would be an economic basket case compared to Dublin. Like, what would be the reason for that?
Yeah, there's no reason why Northern Ireland should be a poor region of a wealthy country. As I say, 100 years ago, it was the wealthiest region of the island here. So it has not performed well in terms of its experience under partition. And I just think there needs to be a recognition, I say this as a Dubliner, like if there was reunification, it would mean that the northeastern part of the country would become much stronger economically. Can you just imagine the flood of foreign direct investment that would go in there? The goodwill that would be coming from the world toward this new shining light of reconciliation on the west coast of Europe? It would do extremely well, and also it would benefit Dublin, because in fact, the dominance that Dublin has economically now, as you said, John, is just damaging to the whole country. It is excessive. And we need to recognise it's hard to get foreign direct investment to move out of Dublin, but if we had a competing economic base such as Belfast, they would go there.
Umar, will you talk to us your views on this? Because you mentioned the flag. John Hume always used to say you can't eat a flag. The importance of the economy and living standards and raising people up out of poverty, and just the importance of that to their sense of dignity and their sense of self.
Well, it's absolutely very important. I mean, I've been so many times to the 6 counties, and to be very honest, I can see the contrast between the living standard there and the contrast here in Dublin. When we have a United Ireland will have an all-Ireland Dáil, and according to the Constitution, the 6 counties will have approximately 30% representation in the United Ireland Dáil. At the moment, their representation, the 6 counties, happens to be 2.7% in the Westminster. So thinking about this fact that they will have so much to say, they will be so influential. And I'm not just talking about nationalists, I'm talking about 15% almost unionists. They all together will have so much say in a United Ireland's Dáil. And that definitely will mean not only will there be investment, there will be a lot of people that have more confidence. And as Jim rightly said, that this part of the world is completely different than Germany. I mean, look at it, the troubles, look at the history of it. I remember when I wanted to move to Ireland in 2003, I mentioned to my dad, and he said, "Are you sure? Is it safe? Are you going to Dublin, Ireland?" And the reality is that Good Friday Agreement and these kind of discussions really give me so much hope that there can be a really great future for all of us, not just people that already live in the 26 counties, but people that are living in the 6 counties whose living standards are not up to the same level. With the United Ireland, we can have we can upgrade their living standard. We can have equality for all, which is really what it is all about. And I hope that we can deliver that together. But it's important, as so many speakers have said, we don't want another Brexit. We really need to be very clear about what the United Ireland is going to mean, how it is going to impact every single individual, and what healthcare, economy, in terms of all different aspects of our life, what it will mean for every single individual on this island.
Mary Lou, on the economy.
So yeah, and of course the 6 counties are northeastern, but let's give a shout out to the northwest, who are currently, I'm sure, going bonkers at the idea that the northwest, because there's I suppose a case study in and of itself. Donegal, Derry. I mean, the natural hinterland of Derry City is into Donegal, and yet we have this bizarre situation where they're in some respect asked to live in 2 different realities. But then you also have the reality of people living, working, marrying, you know, falling in, falling out across the border. Look, I think we have an immense economic opportunity. In fact, for me, the economic argument for Irish unity is a slam dunk. And let me reference the subvention. The subvention is a measure of failure. And I'm always taken when, you know, unions say, well, oh, the subvention, as though this is a positive argument to be advanced for the union, when in fact the subvention demonstrates de facto that the economic system, you know, in that small territory, it just isn't working. And Brexit, as Neil mentioned, the outworking of that, the fact that north-south trade has now spiked, the estimate is somewhere in the region of 1 billion of a spike, although those are early figures. That tells you that when the political circumstances change, business will respond, and not just FDI, which is important. Yes, we need more FDI, but fundamentally we need to ask, what kind of industrial model do we want for Ireland? And in my view, we need to work the FDI piece. We need to ensure that we're getting that investment, but critically, we need to support SMEs, micro businesses, startups and scale-ups, and I think we have an incredible opportunity when you layer on then the green revolution, which I hope we're going to see, the necessity to answer the climate crisis. We have the ingredients here for something phenomenal and dynamic and very attractive for investors internationally, not least, I know myself, in the United States of America. So Belfast was a hub of real prosperity and wealth in the day, and it was also a place of gross discrimination. Just let's remember that, and this is my final point. For me, the new Ireland, prosperity and equality go hand in hand, reinforce each other. They make if we have an equal society based on citizenship, as Omar has said, if we have the smarts to kind of reassess where we're at, look to what we need for the future, we will not just generate prosperity, we will share prosperity, including in this city, where not everybody is living the life. I represent people in Dublin who are poor. They have said, and they've been poor for generations. And for me, a new Ireland, it needs to address that too. It's about the northeast, the northwest, it's about the border region, it's about the southeast, it's about Cork City, it's about Dublin City, it's about Moyross in Limerick. So I think part of our conversation when it comes to the economics and how we live, we need to say this is everybody's business, because this is everybody's future, economically as well as socially.
Okay, Neil, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think it's certainly something when we start to the fact that hopefully sooner rather than we think we're going to be contesting a referendum. And one of the comments when I prattle on about a united Ireland and how bad Brexit is, just to my friends, not necessarily political colleagues, is that really dismissive and arrogant comment, we can't afford it, move on, that's it. And it's wrong. And a lot of the things that we have to do is prepare the myth-busting and the fact-checking, and certainly for politicians in this jurisdiction, when we go out to convince people that we want a united Ireland, because we can't take it for granted that everyone in the 26 counties is going to aspire for this. It's taking that on and say, for 40 years, we were net contributors to the European Union, but now we're net recipients. It's a good thing. And I'm not going to do down on Leitrim, John, but there are many counties in Ireland, if you look at the local property tax, that are net recipients from the Exchequer or net contributors. And that's just the balance. So this notion is we can't afford the 9.5 billion price tag. We bust that myth straight forward. And then when we're speaking to perhaps a more northern audience who you go on some of the more delightful programmes that you don't present, Audrey, on Radio Ulster, and they say that, oh, well, the South's a mess, your housing system's falling apart, we'll be discriminated against, you've no economy there, you've no jobs. These are people who've never come down, like my lovely Uncle Dixon, who never spent a punt in the Free State. And it's going like, well, actually, it's a pretty nice place to live just as Northern Ireland's a pretty nice place to live. And we talk about the Northwest, and this is a key one, just to complement what Mary Lou said. You look at the 70 new medical places in McGee coming on a couple of weeks before announcing a new technical university for the Northwest, Sligo, Letterkenny, GMIT. Like, common sense prevails that all four come together and make that a beacon. I think it's going to be the Atlantic University, bringing over researchers, bringing over academics, bringing over students, paying US fees to come in, and the boom that'll give Letterkenny, Derry, Sligo, Letterfrack for GMIT, and those specialist areas. Like, this is when it gets the really exciting part for me. You can leave about the discussions about identity and reconciliation, but the economic potential of United Ireland is something that when we go out and sell it, particularly in this jurisdiction, this is going to make everyone on this island better off. Not just the people in Tigers Bay or deprived parts of Northern Ireland. This is going to make everyone better off. It's going to consolidate. And the last point, this new independent Ireland, which is coming, is going to be a full member of the European Union. That has already been agreed by the European Council. That isn't something that we're going to have to worry about in a referendum like the Scots had to a couple of years ago. And that's where we really take it and show that level of enthusiasm. And that 20-second dismissal simply isn't good enough.
I mean, it's great words, Neil, and you know, I don't doubt your sincerity. But Jim, you know, the same was said after the Good Friday Agreement, the peace dividend. And while that did deliver for some communities in the north, like you look at Derry, you look at Strabane, you look at that whole region, they're among the poorest in Europe.
I know, because Northern Ireland, unfortunately, hasn't reached its potential. It has remained as a provincial part of a large country and has not achieved its potential. And, you know, we need to recognise that the economy there can be transformed. And there's an opportunity to transform it if people sort of talk about the available chances that can be got there. But if you think as well as when we got our independence, like Ireland would never have got its independence if it was to be decided on economic grounds. Like, we achieved economic success in this country after, I suppose, our membership of the European Union, and particularly once we got into the single market. And that transformed the economy in Ireland.
But do you still envisage a role for EU peace programmes and regional development programmes and so on?
Well, a new country is going to have to get financial support from Britain, from the European Union, from Britain in the short term, from the European Union, from the United States. There will be a huge swell of goodwill towards this new entity. As I said to you, it's unprecedented what we're talking about here. There's a huge amount of work to be done, but it's the logical thing to do, and it would the part of the island that would be most transformed by it economically would be Northern Ireland.
Okay. Well, look, we're going to open the floor now to your good selves, patiently listening and hopefully enjoying the conversation and the discussion here today. So we have a couple of roving microphones with a hand attached to them. And so, yeah, well, you're doing it already. So let's take some questions. So if you would, when we get our microphone to you, if you would stand up and just say your name and direct who you want your question to be answered by. Okay, we'll go for this woman here. With you, just stand up there and we'll get a microphone to you. And yeah, we'll get it around as many people as possible. Thanks so much.
Is it okay to take off the mask while I speak?
Yeah, just put it down, yeah.
So Dave, it's Misha Roisin Nicliam. Really enjoyed all of your contributions. Wish you good deal fad. As you can probably guess from the amount I've said so far, I just would like to bring up the issue of Irish language speakers today. So there's been a lot of talks on rights and I suppose kind of making sure everybody has equal opportunities and everything. And I would just like it's rather maybe a statement as opposed to a question, but just to bring into the discourse the topic of Irish language speakers. I suppose ultimately under the Dublin government and especially in the 6 counties, as we know, things have been dire altogether for Irish speakers since the establishment of the Free State. And I would just hope that maybe we could discuss how Irish can be protected going forward, as this is the decade of opportunity, as we all know. So I just want to make sure that the rights of English or Irish language speakers are progressed rather than regressed.
Okay, thank you very much, Roisin. Do you want to start with that? Yeah. Okay, we'll go to this gentleman here with his hand up, and then we'll move over to this side.
Damien White's my name, and I have a quick question for Jim and maybe a comment for Neil. I can't speak for anyone else in the room, but I know that I'm extremely proud that we live in a republic. I'm very, very proud that we live in a democratic republic, and I'm extremely proud that we're now net contributors to the European Union, because I think it says about where we've been and where we're going. Jim in the past has made comments that we do live in a democracy, and that he's saying that maybe we should give 2 seats to Unionists in the cabinet in any future Dáil United Ireland. I'm a Democrat. I believe in democracy. If the Unionists achieve 10 seats and go into government as part of a coalition, so be it. You know, we could have a Unionist Taoiseach and fair play. How does he level that off with this being a democracy and a republic? And the comment I have for Neil is comments that he's made before about a Commonwealth. Based on what I've just said and things I'm proud to be, and I hope to go forward as this nation, is that in a Commonwealth, I personally will not see myself subjected, or my children subjected, or be a subject to any foreign dysfunctional family who arrives in a very dysfunctional country, whose country is doing nothing but trying to tear to shreds everything I am so proud of. So, Jim, how can you reconcile your comments on democracy? And this is my comment to Neil.
Lovely, thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Go ahead, Jim.
I'll just deal first of all with Roisin's point. I agree, Roisin, that obviously people who speak Irish and Irish language enthusiasts have to have their rights protected. But I think also we need to recognise that in a new united Ireland, like, I don't think we can expect to make it mandatory that people living in East Belfast have to learn Irish. So I think we need to recognise that. But the rights of individual speakers needs to be respected. In terms of what Damien's saying, you're right in terms of the point I made, but what I would say, in any new constitution, I think we should have 2 houses of legislature. And the main house representative of the people would obviously have to be elected based on 1 person, 1 vote. But if you look at the way we deal with the Irish, or the Senate as it existed prior to 1937, and the Senate today, it's not necessarily representative of the population at large. And I think we should be looking at an upper house of the legislature that would be elected not based on a per capita basis, but that it would be weighted to give different traditions more of a say in it. In terms of the cabinet and the government, I did mention in my paper that obviously one of the mechanisms whereby we could ensure that protection could be given to unionism was to ensure that in the government of a country that 1 or 2 seats would be allocated to unionism. And that's something that I think we should engage with, and I think it's something we should be capable of talking about. Because I suppose one of the concerns of unionism at this stage would be, God, what are we getting into? Are they getting into a country over which they have no control? But listen, my dream and my belief is what will happen after reunification is that the issues of green and orange will completely fade and be gone. And ultimately, in 50, 60 years from now, people will be deciding their politics and government based on their policies to political issues as opposed to whether they're unionist or Republican. So I think in the short term it is an appropriate thing to consider, Damien.
Thank you, Jim. And Neil, would you address that?
Just kind of in reverse order, in terms of my paper, I never talked about reserved seats for unions, something like that. I did talk about rotation of committee chairs and a Cahirlic or last Cahirlic. But just in relation to the Commonwealth, and it's not something I want to get bogged down to, but I think when we talk about myth busting, it's very clear. There are a majority of members of the Commonwealth are republics. Their citizens aren't subject to the head of the Commonwealth. Yes, the head of the Commonwealth at the moment is Queen Elizabeth II of England, but that's not an automatic. In fact, they've changed that. We, as an independent country, are a member of the Francophonie, we're a member of the Portuguese-speaking countries. You know, what sort of a definition of maturity and indeed self-confidence is to join the Commonwealth and look at the positives it could add in terms of trade, in terms of access to the games, and indeed potentially, but not rooted on, possible reconciliation. But I will also stress that is a personal opinion. I'm one of a mighty 2 Oireachtas members who are in favour of it, so it's not exactly something that I champion as the most important thing. But it's also, it's funny, many times on social media, I'm called a unionist and much worse simply because I support that. And I think if we're going to have this conversation, we have to be frank that if someone's in favour of Ireland rejoining the Commonwealth, that doesn't put them on the same platform as someone like Sammy Wilson or Jamie Bryson. And that's my opinion and the personal one. In relation, just belatedly, to the Irish language and the rights of Gaelgery, it's very important that it is supported in a new state, that it still remains our language, but also, as Jim said, it's not mandatory or arbitrary for everyone. But we also look, firstly, to support the Ulster Scots movement. I come from an Ulster Scots tradition. I know how important it is for many people on the island. But also, one thing that we fail as a state is our level of multilingualism. And if we're talking about the economy and we're talking about the development, it's getting more people learning more languages earlier on in school. I'll be quite frank, my French is better than my Irish, and that's simply because I lived in Belgium for a couple of years. It's not through to our education system, and what's holding us back for attracting FDI and making us EMEA hubs is the lack of linguistic capability. And I think that's something in tandem with promoting the Irish language and not making a political issue, but mere a cultural issue, an economic issue. That's something that really, again, excites me about the new Ireland.
Yes, can I just say, because East Belfast was, Jim said we shouldn't make it mandatory in East Belfast, and we shouldn't. We don't have to. In fact, East Belfast they're voting with their feet and with their Fáinne and I want to commend Linda Irvine for the incredible work that she has done, a loyalist woman to her roots. Well done. And Roisin, just to say, our travails with Acht Gaeilge, I have a commitment from the British government to deliver that legislation. I expect it to be delivered. So, and just, I think we need to be careful not to be kind of tokenistic as regards on Gaeilge, like Gaeilge is the príomh teanga den Stáit. There's what does that mean? Gach-skull, Gael-skull. I think we can look at that and we can accommodate diverse. That's what makes this place incredible. It's not that we're all the same, but that we're all different.
Okay, thank you very much. Now this gentleman here has a question.
Thank you. Damien Lynch coming up from Cork this morning, so I'm happy to be here. Question, not so much a question, it's more of an opinion. We have a tendency to do knee-jerk reaction in Ireland. I mean, when Brexit happened, a lot of my friends were saying, oh my God, we'll have to follow them out. And my opinion was, why would we do that? I mean, at the time, our 12.5% tax, a gateway into Europe for American business and such things. Why would we do that? What I'm saying is there's a narrative there where people don't sort of reason the economics as such. Now, also, you have a situation where most people, and it's true for all of us, we tend to add, we tend to count. So when you hear people talk about how could we afford it, what they fail to understand is that we need to change the narrative to more of a multiplication. From an economist's perspective, everything is the multiplier. You saw there with COVID and everything collapsed. Nothing happening, no activity, no economy. We get going now, you're going to have a massive upswing. But Mary is right, Mary Lou is correct about the economy in the north relying on the subvention. It is a source of failure. It's like an alimony check going over to an abandoned family. The situation is there is no economy as such there other than civil service and some agriculture and shops. There's no economic engine. You have a situation where it's literally, it's a countable economy, but not one where one is sort of like a multiplicative economy. Now, I don't want to get too technical about it, but as Jim was saying, the goodwill from other parts of the world. In a scheme of unification, obviously there'd be a situation where there'd be sort of a British financial withdrawal. I'm sure there'd be money from Europe, and of course, America has always helped Ireland. So you would have a situation where a massive multiplication in the economy in the north. That is how we could afford it. Not sort of like how many taxes do we have to pay as such. That's the narrative we need to change in this country.
Thank you so much, that's great. Now this lady here, if we can get a microphone to her, please. Thank you.
A question, short question for Mary Lou MacDonald and for John Doyle. Do you think the current tensions over Brexit make reunification, or unification of Ireland rather, more likely or less likely?
Thank you. John, will you take that first?
I think probably yes is the... I mean, we wouldn't have been having this meeting in 2015, that's the truth of it. It might have been a good idea to have it, but we probably wouldn't have had it. And we probably wouldn't have been booked out. And there wouldn't be a load of them across the country. There wouldn't have been the sort of opinion poll data you're getting, contested, depending on who does the poll and the way they ask the questions, but nonetheless, there is a change there. And I think that has fundamentally, I think Neil made the comment earlier, it has changed the question and the answer in some ways, that a united Ireland inside the European Union is in some ways, particularly for people who haven't grown up in a traditional national union position, has fundamentally altered the prospects for United Ireland. It's just a totally different proposition, and therefore I think it has made a poll more likely, and I think it's made a positive outcome for unification more likely.
Okay, Mary Lou. Well, I've been talking about Irish unity all my life, so I've been at lots of these meetings over a very long period of time. But yes, Brexit has broadened the scope, and it's posed a number of questions to lots of people who didn't think about the border, didn't think about the constitutional question, because it's now not just Irish or British, it's now European or not. It's now on the fringes or at the centre, and that's it. That's a huge, huge question. So yes, it has hurried things along, and sometimes it's happenstance, you know. If you're to look a century back and you were to look at the mistakes that the British government made in terms of their war effort and conscription and how that triggered a big reaction, that's politics, that's life, those are the things that shape and drive change. It doesn't make unity inevitable. It has hastened the debate. But I think this was happening anyway, folks. I think when you look to the loss of the unionist electoral majority, it's gone. It's not coming back. When you look at demographic and social changes, I think a moment arrives for big ideas. And I think the moment has arrived now for this conversation. But Brexit, yes, has fueled it along without a doubt.
Thank you very much. This gentleman here.
Hello, Tyrone Falls, originally from Antrim, now living in Dublin. One quick question. Why did in the panel's opinion, what is stopping the current Southern government from setting up a citizens' assembly?
Okay, Jim, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. I know the issue of the Citizens' Assembly is a contentious issue, and people say we should just establish it. The answer to your question, I think, is that the shared island unit, which has been established by the current government, is making a lot of progress in terms of engagement between the two territories and between the two communities. And I know from engagement with the unionist people I spoke to that they do see the shared island unit as being very positive. Listen, I think a Citizens' Assembly has an important role to play. But I think we need to recognise, as I said earlier on, that the Citizens' Assembly is put together to deal with a specific, in the past we've used it for specific articles of the Constitution. People are asked to delve into it very thoroughly for a period of 14 weekends, and they come voluntarily from different parts of the country. My own concern in respect to this, if we ask a Citizens' Assembly of 100 people to come together and to deal with the question of Irish unification, like, it's an extraordinary amount of work to ask them to do. And I think that's why the preparatory work in terms of the strands, like the example of the constitutional issue, let's prepare a draft constitution and then get a Citizens' Assembly together and say, listen, will you come up to us and back to us with ideas about the sensitive issues, the emblems, the flags, the anthems, and what are your issues in respect of the rights that we've set out in the draft constitution? So that's my answer to it. But I understand that there is annoyance about the fact that the government won't establish a Citizens' Assembly. I don't think the government is committed against it, but I just think there are technical reasons for it, and I think more work needs to be done before we engage the work of a Citizens' Assembly.
Okay, thank you. Yourself there.
Diagwich, my name is Noah, and Mary Lou McDonald touched on the future generation, and as a 16-year-old, my fears for the future Ireland are on housing and student accommodation and all these different issues. And how does taking on the financial burden of another country dispel my fears about housing and all those types of issues? And I went to Belfast over the summer, and when you're going around Belfast, you have to be consciously thinking of what bar we're going into, what street we're walking down. And for people, how do we dispel this fear of division? And because it was touched on that we need to look forward, but history is still relevant and it's still very much prevalent and it's still in the mindset of the Irish people. So that opens up to the panel.
That is for sure. I'll talk to you, Mary Lou, but John, I mean, maybe you'd address the economic thing, but also the too much unresolved history, the legacy.
That presupposes that you can solve that legacy before you have a debate in United Ireland. And there's certainly no clear evidence that that is the only order in which you can do things. I would say the evidence perhaps is that's not the order in which to do things. Or at the very least, there's no objection to doing them in parallel.
But then it never gets done.
No, and I would think if you were to wait until there was reconciliation of the island of Ireland, before we have a debate about planning for United Ireland, Boris Johnson would have called 10 border polls before we'd be halfway through the conversation. And that's the sort of issue. I'm not just being glib about it, but this debate could happen. And the day a referendum is called is in some ways the day reflection ends. In the middle of a 3-week referendum campaign, it's about persuading people to vote yes or no or whatever words we're using. The days for nuance are well before somebody puts a date on it. So that's where you talk about how would the economy deal with the housing crisis? How would it pay for health? How would we deal with diversity? You know, people haven't even begun to talk about seats in cabinet, the role of the Seanad. And to be honest, if we were to pull 100 random people into a hall at the moment and ask them to talk about it, we wouldn't have much to tell them in the first place. You know, we need to say, well, what's been experienced in other countries where they've had 2 federal units? And it's almost uniformly bad, is the quick end of the book. There's almost not a single 2-unit federation in the world that has worked.
Okay.
We could have a 4-unit federation here, or we could have minority rights in a parliament in Dublin. The Seanad could be made up of 50% of people from the previous territory of Northern Ireland with the right to delay legislation or ask for it to be reconsidered by the Dáil. There's lots of stuff out there from international evidence. And what we need to do is bring that into a more focused conversation and say, well, what are the 2 or 3 we want to look at seriously? And the rest don't seem to suit us for this purpose. But we're not starting from scratch. Other people have tackled these issues about the links between political and constitutional change and, if you like, the real life of the economy, health and housing.
Umar, do you want to come in there?
I just want to say that, you know, it is basically partition that creates division and creates us versus them narrative. And that is what has happened in the 6 counties. And in a united Ireland, obviously, we're getting rid of the partition. We're uniting everybody, providing equal citizenship, equality to everybody. What happens is, I worked a lot in radicalization that is related to religious motivated violence. And the research is that it is the socially, economically deprived areas where you find people easily fall into the trap of radicalization, division, extremism, etc. And when you have societies where people are economically stable, equally equal, and they have a good financial life, they can bring the children to school, they have a good health care, people will not fall into the trap of this division then. So I think when you look at it from that perspective, a united Ireland is actually going to provide a solution and is going to get rid of the division that we have there in the 6 counties.
Okay, thank you so much.
Noah, thanks so much for your question. You articulated that really well. So let me just say something back to you to disentangle this conundrum. Firstly, I think it's a mistake to refer to the North as another country. And I think it's, and look, I'm saying this to help with the question because the question's a really, really important one. And I think it's also a mistake, as we discussed earlier, to assume we are taking on this massive financial burden. I don't know what age, you're 16 now, actually, you said, so I wouldn't ask you to do that. That would not be a reasonable ask to burden our 16-year-old population with insurmountable debt. On the contrary. See, I think if you look through a different perspective and say, what happened 100 years ago, the consequences are manifest there for all of us to see. But actually the answer, the solution is in creating an economy of scale, in giving us a chance collectively to get things right around housing, to get things right about higher level education and and all of the things that rightly are on the mind of a 16-year-old. And in fairness, we have shown ourselves able to innovate. The power sharing regime or executive in the North is unique and kind of weird in some ways, but we make it work. It's not perfect, but we do our best to make it work. And also just remember this, unlike when this state was founded, the Civil War, you didn't talk about it. I mean, I know in my own family, and we were on the losing side, in other words, we were anti-treaty. You didn't open your mouth. People left in huge numbers to America. There was no room here. By contrast, in this generation of peace building and the Good Friday Agreement, at least there was an acknowledgement that you have to find a place for that hurt. And Noah, just remember this, We managed unionists, nationalists, loyalists, the whole lot. The Irish parties actually agreed the mechanisms by which we will talk about and resolve these really, really difficult issues around the past, and conflict and loss of life and suffering. And then the British government came in with the big state security concern and knocked the whole thing off kilter. And I'm only saying that to you to say, of course people bring our baggage. We're human beings, that's how it is. But I would not like any 16-year-old, whatever perspective you're coming from, to imagine that our baggage needs to be your baggage, or that in any event the baggage can't be unpacked, because it can be. We can do that.
Okay, thank you, Mary Lou. Okay, we've just time for a couple more questions. I know there's so many of you want to get in, but we've only a limited amount of time. Do you have the microphone? Yeah, you do. Fire ahead.
Jidív agus gur míle mágah, Andrew McFadden is onium do, agus is as Durame, Octami Mahoney at Walyak. Good afternoon, thank you very much for your contributions and your answers to the questions so far. My name is Andrew McFadden, I am originally from Derry, I'm now living in Dublin. And my question is a very brief one, and it just comes back to engagement, which has been touched on several times by all 5 of you this afternoon. Now, it'll come as no surprise based on my opening remark there that I identify very strongly as a Northern Republican. And when it comes time for the border poll, as I hope will be in the not too distant future, my vote is pretty much assured. I'm also very encouraged to hear the contributions from the panel when it comes to engaging with members of the unionist community and the specifics, particularly from yourselves, Jim and Neil, when it comes to how we do that. My question comes back to the middle ground in the north, because that is increasing and increasing as every election goes on. I saw one poll yesterday which put the Alliance Party at 17.9%, and there have been higher polls than that on various occasions. How do we engage with that middle ground? Because I know many people who I was at school with, at university with, who have now started voting or who have even joined the Alliance Party, and they're not too fussed on their constitutional view. So how do we persuade them that their place, their rightful place, is as part of a united Ireland? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah.
To Andrew, and you're right in terms of what you say. There is a growing middle ground in Northern Ireland that doesn't view themselves as either green or orange. And that, the logic of that and the development of that is towards reunification. Because a lot of those people want to be part of Europe. They want to be part of the European Union. They see their future as being part of the European Union. And I think logic will allow those people to come and talk to other groups such as us who are talking about United Ireland. I suppose you're right. We maybe need to think of other ways of directly engaging with the Alliance Party. Like maybe, I think the fear of, as I said at the outset, the fear that people had in the past of talking about United Ireland, that's gone now. It's not the property of any one political party or any one political ideology. It's now seen as a logical method of resolving the difficulties that have arisen, predominantly because of Brexit, but which can be resolved through that discussion. Just in terms of what Noah is saying as well, Noah, irrespective of what happens with this debate and whether there is a United Ireland, that polarisation that exists within Northern Ireland has to be tackled and resolved. But my own assessment of it is that as the monoliths sink, that the irreconcilability of the two traditions will fade away. And actually, those of us who advocate reunification are playing our part in the reduction of the monoliths. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. And we get a microphone to this gentleman here, please. Thank you. And I'll take Francis next. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Jim Howe. Thanks very much for all your contributions. There's just one thing that hasn't been touched on. And I'm kind of waiting for it and kind of saying, we haven't discussed the security situation in the north and the woeful, I suppose, our own defence forces here in what is now the Republic are woefully small. I mean, 10,000 or so. I mean, ridiculously small. And we have a situation where we could be put into a scenario where we would actually have to have a bigger area to police with possibly a certain amount of people who would not want to be policed. Now, I'm not asking the army to police, but we have to look at the security issues that it would imply. And you cannot just magic an army up overnight or any security services overnight. That's the first thing. The second thing is, where would this new republic or federal Ireland stand regards NATO, regards European Army, regarding neutrality? My own view on it is if you're going to be neutral, you should be able to be neutral, not depend on the RAF to keep Russian airplanes out of your airspace or naval services. If we're going to be part of the European Army, we should contribute. So the whole idea of security and defence hasn't been spoken about, and it's just something I'd love to hear from the panel, please.
Thank you so much. John, would you start us off on that, and then a couple of minutes?
I think there's a couple of issues here. In terms of, I think the last thing you'd want to do is start off with the presumption you're going to deal with any loyalist resistance to United Ireland by sending young lads from Finner camp in to sort of deal with it. No harm to the sort of there, but that's not the approach you want to take. In fact, if you look at the combined resources of An Garda Síochána and the PSNI in the island of Ireland, it's a relatively large police force for historic reasons. So in terms of internal policing, as a sort of policing we'd hope would resolve any sort of issues, and just general policing for society, criminal gangs and whatnot, I think that by our standards we have a decent. The issue is probably in terms of defence forces, where there's been a long-running issue with paying conditions, obviously, in the defence forces, and some progress been made in recent years around equipment. But you always then you get this sort of, you put things on the long finger, and then you end up in an embarrassing situation like trying to get people out of Kabul, and people say, well, we should take a plane from Ryanair, and let them fly a plane without any protective equipment into the middle of Kabul. I don't think you'd have too many volunteers looking to do that job. But it's obviously very hard for a government to say, let's spend 100 million on a plane that we didn't think we needed for the last 10 years. So it is, I don't in some ways beat people to death on this issue. It's a tricky issue of the balance between what you spend on defence and security compared to hospitals and other things. By European standards, I think it probably should be a bit more, but it's what you spend it on is the sort of issue. Okay. And finally, on the issue of sort of European security, I think there's no doubt the European Union is playing a bigger role in terms of global security projection. For me, I've no personal hang-ups about NATO, but in some ways, I think its time has passed in many regards. I would often say to colleagues who are sort of going to this is, because in academic circles, NATO is often the gold standard for are you serious about it? But does anyone here really believe that if Turkey got themselves into a mess with the Kurds and end up with the Iraqi army heading into eastern Turkey, that America, Britain and Germany would go to war to defend Erdogan if he got himself into a mess, even though the NATO treaty says they should? Or even slightly more chillingly, if the Russians moved into Novara, an almost exclusively Russian-speaking town on the Estonian border, we'd condemn it, we'd never recognise it, but would all of NATO go to war about it? The Estonians are not at all confident. So NATO in some ways, I think, is an irrelevancy in terms of how we traditionally saw it, in terms of war for one, war for all. But there is a need for the European Union to be able to better deal with conflicts on its borders and beyond with humanitarian consequences without always having to ask the Americans would they do it for us. And I think I think there is room for a debate. I think the public are in favour of neutrality as a concept and an ideology. But there was no problem. I haven't heard a single person beyond a few nut jobs who thought the Irish Army were doing the wrong thing by going into Kosovo or going into Bosnia, even though technically NATO was running the security operation on the ground. Because the mission was right, the troops were doing the right thing, it wasn't invading the place and the public wanted us there. So I think there's a lot of maturity in the public to deal with these issues, and I think that's a conversation we can have. Interestingly, it almost never comes up in conversation with unionists. It's not, they have a long list of things that they worry about United Ireland, but NATO, for me, I've never had it raised once in an awful lot of conversations.
Okay, Jim, quick.
Yeah, just Jim. Unification doesn't mean uniformity. One of the successes of the peace process has been the PSNI. And there's no reason why we shouldn't retain a regionalised police force if we have a reunited Ireland. And maybe the Gardaí and the government here could learn something from the regionalisation that's taken place in Northern Ireland. So I don't see that as being an obstacle. In terms of a military state, Ireland was never a military state. I think we should retain our neutrality in a new reunited Ireland. I don't see us getting engaged in military activity other than through the United Nations. And I don't think it's going to be acceptable to a new United Ireland that we try to plough in lots of hard-pressed money to develop a much bigger army than would be there already.
Okay, and Mary Lou.
Well, I think it's an interesting question that you raise, and I think it's something we need to talk about. mean, I don't envisage a new Ireland as like a hard military power. I just think there's questions of scale here in any event. We're a small island. But I think what we can have is incredible influence and soft power. And I know when it comes to whatever about the military hardware and how you invest in that, and we need to pay people a proper wage. You see, if we're not looking after people who are currently serving in Óglaigh na hÉireann, well then we're at nothing. And women, by the way, there's an issue clearly within the army on that. So we need to deal with all of those, but we have to have an eye to what would the foreign policy, what's the general foreign policy disposition of Ireland be? And I think on lots of issues, I'm going to cite Palestine for the purposes of this conversation. I could cite others where there is a very, very clear analysis across Irish society. So we can't allow others to blunt our capacity to be effective. And one of the things, as John has said, that there's almost uniformity across Irish society is a great sense of pride in the Blue Berets and our ability to go anywhere pretty much and to bring peace missions. And I think we guard that. That's gold dust. That's our, if we're talking about unique selling points, that's a unique, almost unique selling point for Irish troops.
Okay, thanks so much. Look, I'm going to finish it off with a question here from Francis. So if we can get a microphone up here, please, that'd be great. I know there's so many of you and we could spend the rest of the afternoon, but I know that we're already over time and you have places to go. Okay, yeah, sure. Take that one quickly, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to second Dr. Omar Al-Qadri and thank him for articulating our views sufficiently, because that is who we are. We are a nation of multiple identities, and we truly believe in the Irish Republic. So thank you very much for that. Secondly, I believe that Irish unification is our eternal duty. It is something that's been incomplete, and until that completes, our freedom is incomplete. And I think that is what Michael Collins said, that I'm signing my death warrant, because this is something that I give you so you can attain that freedom in the future. Lastly, I want to ask you all, how can we as citizens help you achieve this vision? Because political will change every now and then, but what is our role and our duty in helping achieving and creating a just environment for collective growth? Thank you.
Super, thank you so much. Thanks for that question. Neil, do you want to answer that last point?
And thanks so much for the question and the inspiring words, to be honest. It's a lovely one to kind of finish on. I think we all have a duty and responsibility to this conversation. Some of us hold positions through the grace of the electorate where we can have more direct say and more direct coverage. But I think it's very important how we frame this conversation, and that comes down to all of us and the language we use. And there should be no hierarchy of those of us who aspire for unity. We all aspire for unity, we all work for it. And I think that times when you look at the discourse about this issue is we tend, unfortunately, to turn into the negative skid. And that's something I was struck, I was your age when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And the Northern Ireland I knew then, visiting relations in Ballynahinch and Banbridge, was very different to today. It's a much better place now, and the entire island is a better place, and it will and can be a much better place on unity. And that's the emphasis in the conversation that all of us have a duty to continue to push. This is about making everyone's life better, regardless of their identity or their background.
Thank you, Neil. Well, look, I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you so much for being such a brilliant audience, so engaging and so engaged in the topic. Thanks to Neil, to Jim, to Mary Lou, to Umar, and to John as well for taking part, and to everyone at Ireland's Future for organising this. So thank you for joining in. Continue the discussion, I suppose, the conversation, and we'll talk again. Safe home.